Hello, friends. Tonight we are your guests with a story titled The Tediously Fascinating Rise and Fall of the Byzantine Empire, a sleep-inducing and profound tale from 1,000 years of forgotten glory of the Byzantine Empire. I would be happy if you tell me which country you are from and which part of history you are most interested in, so that I can become more familiar with your interests. And I would be grateful if you liked this video, subscribe to me and activate the bell. And by the way, prepare a coffee because you are going to sleep late tonight. In the year 330 AD, as spring arrived with its gentle warmth across the Bosphorus, Emperor Constantine the Great stood upon the ancient walls of Byzantium, gazing across the shimmering waters that separated Europe from Asia. The salt-tinged breeze carried with it the weight of empire, the burden of transformation, and the slow, methodical process of creating what would become known as Constantinople. The decision to establish a new capital was not made hastily. For months, Constantine had deliberated, consulting endless scrolls of administrative records, reviewing tax collection reports from across the empire, and listening to the droning voices of his countless advisors. Each meeting stretched into the late hours of the evening, filled with discussions about grain supplies, harbor depths, defensive positions, and the intricate details of urban planning that would bore even the most dedicated historian to tears. The construction of New Rome proceeded with the same methodical precision that characterized every aspect of Roman administration. Stone by stone, column by column, the city rose from the ancient Greek foundations. Workers arrived each dawn, their footsteps echoing through the morning mist as they carried their tools to construction sites that would remain active for decades. The sound of chisels against marble created a rhythmic symphony that lulled the city into a perpetual state of industrious tranquility. Constantine's vision extended far beyond mere architecture. He envisioned a city that would serve as the administrative heart of the Eastern Empire, complete with all the bureaucratic complexities that such a role demanded. The establishment of the Senate of Constantinople required months of careful deliberation about precedents, seating arrangements, and the precise wording of ceremonial addresses. Each senator's robes had to be tailored according to strict specifications, their homes assigned based on elaborate calculations of rank and favor. The religious transformation of the city proceeded with equal deliberation. The construction of the original Church of the Holy Apostles involved endless consultations with bishops, architects, and imperial advisors. Every detail, from the positioning of the altar to the arrangement of the marble columns, was debated at length in meetings that often lasted from sunrise to sunset. The soft murmur of theological discussions filled the imperial chambers, creating an atmosphere of scholarly contemplation that seemed to slow time itself. As the years passed, the administrative apparatus of Constantinople grew increasingly complex. The establishment of the various governmental departments required the creation of numerous bureaucratic positions, each with its own specific duties, privileges, and ceremonial functions. The Department of the Sacred Largesses alone employed hundreds of clerks, accountants, and inspectors, all working in vast, echoing halls filled with the gentle scratching of quills on parchment. The daily routine of these bureaucrats followed patterns that would remain unchanged for centuries. Each morning, they would arrive at their designated posts, arrange their writing materials with meticulous care, and begin the slow process of copying, filing, and reviewing the endless stream of documents that flowed through the imperial administration. The sound of their quiet industry created a constant, soothing backdrop to life in the capital. The reign of Justinian, beginning in 527 AD, marked a period of unprecedented administrative expansion and legal codification. The emperor's passion for systematic organization led to projects of staggering scope and complexity. The compilation of the Corpus Juris Civilis required teams of legal scholars to work for years, examining thousands of laws, precedents, and imperial edicts. They labored in libraries, filled with the musty scent of ancient parchments, their voices barely above whispers as they debated the finest points of jurisprudence. The construction of Hagia Sophia during Justinian's reign exemplified the empire's approach to monumental projects. Every aspect of the great church's design was subject to extensive consultation and revision. The selection of materials alone required months of correspondence with quarries across the empire. Marble columns were carefully chosen for their color and grain, while the positioning of each architectural element was calculated according to complex mathematical principles that few could fully comprehend. The daily services at Hagia Sophia, once completed, followed elaborate liturgical patterns that had been refined through countless hours of practice and revision. The imperial choir spent years perfecting their harmonies, their voices echoing through the vast dome in a manner that seemed to suspend time itself. The ceremonial movements of the priests, the precise timing of the incense, the careful arrangement of the congregation, all followed protocols that had been developed through patient trial and countless minor adjustments. The Persian Wars of Justinian's era dragged on with the same methodical persistence that characterized all imperial endeavors. Military campaigns were planned with exhaustive attention to supply lines, seasonal weather patterns, and diplomatic protocols. Generals spent weeks drafting orders for troop movements, calculating provisions needed for extended sieges, and composing lengthy reports to be sent back to Constantinople. The actual fighting, when it occurred, often seemed almost incidental to the vast bureaucratic machinery that supported it. The plague that struck Constantinople in 541 AD was documented with the same systematic thoroughness that the empire applied to all significant events. Imperial physicians compiled detailed reports on symptoms, treatments, and mortality rates. Clerks maintained careful records of affected neighborhoods, economic disruptions, and administrative adjustments required by the crisis. Even in the face of catastrophe, the machinery of bureaucracy continued to function with its characteristic, almost hypnotic regularity. The administrative reforms that followed the plague required years of careful implementation. New health regulations were drafted, revised, and redrafted multiple times before being formally promulgated. The establishment of quarantine procedures involved extensive consultation with medical authorities, port officials, and trade representatives. Every aspect of the new system was documented in triplicate, filed in the appropriate archives, and subjected to periodic review by specially appointed commissions. The construction projects that continued throughout this period followed the same patterns of methodical planning and execution. The restoration of the city's aqueducts required teams of engineers to conduct surveys, prepare detailed drawings, and supervise the slow process of repair and expansion. Workers labored through the seasons, their progress measured not in dramatic achievements, but in the steady accumulation of small, careful improvements. The educational institutions of Constantinople developed their own elaborate traditions and procedures. The Imperial University's curriculum was structured according to principles that emphasized gradual, systematic learning. Students progressed through carefully designed stages of instruction, each building upon the previous with the patience of generations. Lectures were delivered in a measured, contemplative style that reflected the empire's preference for thorough understanding over quick comprehension. The legal courts of the capital operated according to procedures that had been refined through centuries of practice. Cases were heard with meticulous attention to precedent and procedure. Judges took their time in deliberation, consulting vast libraries of legal texts and conferring with their colleagues in discussions that could continue for days. The very architecture of the courtrooms, with their high ceilings and excellent acoustics, seemed designed to encourage thoughtful, unhurried consideration of each matter brought before them. As the 7th century approached, the administrative traditions established during these foundational centuries had become as permanent and immutable as the great walls that surrounded the city. The empire had developed a rhythm of governance that would persist through countless changes of leadership, military campaigns, and external pressures. This rhythm, steady and predictable as the tides of the Bosphorus, would carry the empire forward into centuries of continued, methodical existence. The 7th century dawned upon Constantinople with the same measured tranquility that had characterized the empire's development. Yet it brought with it challenges that would test the methodical patience of Byzantine administration. The Arab conquests, which began in earnest during the 630s, unfolded not as sudden catastrophes, but as a series of prolonged campaigns that stretched across decades, each requiring the same careful logistical planning that had become the hallmark of imperial governance. Emperor Heraclius, faced with the loss of Syria and Egypt, responded with the systematic thoroughness that characterized all Byzantine military endeavors. The planning for each campaign involved months of preparation, during which quartermasters calculated supply requirements down to the last bushel of grain, while military engineers prepared detailed maps showing every road, bridge, and water source along the proposed routes of march. These planning sessions took place in chambers where the only sounds were the soft rustling of parchment and the gentle scratching of quills recording every minute detail. The theological controversies that emerged during this period reflected the empire's approach to intellectual discourse, favoring exhaustive examination over hasty resolution. The Monothelite controversy, which dominated much of the 7th century, generated thousands of pages of carefully reasoned theological treatises. Bishops and theologians spent years in deliberation, examining every aspect of the nature of Christ with the same methodical precision that characterized imperial administration. Their discussions proceeded at a pace that seemed almost deliberately designed to promote contemplation and gradual understanding. The Council of Constantinople in 680 AD exemplified the empire's approach to resolving complex theological questions. The proceedings extended over many months, with each session following elaborate protocols that had been developed through centuries of ecclesiastical tradition. Delegates spoke in measured tones, their arguments unfolding with careful logic and extensive citation of scriptural and patristic authorities. The very atmosphere of these gatherings, held in chambers perfumed with incense and illuminated by the soft glow of countless candles, seemed to encourage patient reflection rather than heated debate. The military reforms of the Heraclian dynasty introduced the theme system, a reorganization of provincial administration that required decades to implement fully. The process of establishing each new theme involved extensive surveys of agricultural resources, population assessments, and careful calculations of military obligations. Imperial commissioners traveled throughout the provinces, conducting interviews with local officials, examining tax records, and preparing detailed reports that would inform the gradual transformation of the empire's administrative structure. The siege of Constantinople by the Arabs in 718 AD demonstrated the empire's capacity for patient, methodical defense. The preparations for the siege had begun months in advance, with city officials organizing the systematic stockpiling of provisions, the careful maintenance of the city's walls, and the coordination of defensive measures that had been refined through generations of military experience. The siege itself unfolded with the same measured pace that characterized all Byzantine endeavors, each day bringing small adjustments to defensive positions and supply arrangements. Leo III's iconoclastic policies, introduced in the 720s, sparked theological debates that would continue for over a century. The implementation of iconoclasm proceeded with characteristic imperial thoroughness, involving the systematic documentation of religious images throughout the empire, the careful development of new liturgical practices, and the patient education of clergy and laity in the theological principles underlying the new policies. The removal of icons from churches was conducted according to elaborate protocols designed to minimize disorder, while ensuring complete compliance with imperial directives. The theological treatises produced during the iconoclastic period reflected the empire's scholarly traditions of exhaustive examination and careful argumentation. Writers like John of Damascus composed works of staggering length and complexity, examining every aspect of the controversy with methodical precision. These texts were copied and distributed throughout the empire by scribes whose patient labor ensured the preservation and dissemination of theological knowledge. The scriptoriums where this work was carried out were havens of quiet concentration, filled with the gentle sounds of quills on parchment and the soft murmur of scholarly discussion. The military campaigns of the iconoclastic emperors against the Arabs and Bulgars followed the same patterns of careful planning and methodical execution that had characterized Byzantine warfare for centuries. Each expedition was preceded by extensive preparations involving the assembly of supplies, the recruitment and training of troops, and the detailed planning of campaign routes. The actual fighting, when it occurred, was often less significant than the vast logistical effort required to maintain armies in the field for months at a time. The restoration of icon veneration under Irene in 787 AD required the same systematic approach that had characterized its original suppression. The Second Council of Nicaea, convened to address the iconoclastic controversy, followed the established patterns of Byzantine ecclesiastical assemblies. Delegates engaged in lengthy deliberations, examining theological arguments with the patience of scholars who understood that truth emerged through careful consideration rather than hasty judgment. The council's proceedings were recorded in detail by scribes whose work ensured that future generations would have access to the complete record of these important discussions. The Bulgars' wars of the 8th and 9th centuries exemplified the empire's approach to frontier defense, combining patient diplomacy with methodical military preparation. The construction of fortifications along the Bulgarian frontier required years of careful planning and execution. Engineers surveyed potential sites, calculated the amount of stone and timber required, and supervised the slow process of construction that would continue through multiple campaign seasons. These fortifications, built according to architectural principles that had been refined through centuries of experience, represented the empire's commitment to long-term strategic planning. The reign of Basil the Vash, beginning in 867 AD, marked the establishment of the Macedonian dynasty and a period of renewed administrative reform. The compilation of the Basilica, a comprehensive legal code that would govern the empire for centuries, required teams of legal scholars to work for decades, examining every aspect of imperial law with systematic thoroughness. The project involved the careful comparison of existing legal texts, the resolution of apparent contradictions, and the preparation of new provisions to address contemporary needs. The scholars who undertook this work labored in libraries where the only sounds were the turning of pages and the soft murmur of scholarly consultation. The military campaigns of Basil the Fair against the Arabs in southern Italy proceeded with the same methodical approach that characterized all Byzantine military endeavors. The recapture of Bari in 876 AD required months of careful siege preparations, during which imperial engineers constructed elaborate siege works while quartermasters organized the steady supply of provisions for the besieging army. The siege itself unfolded with patient persistence, each day bringing small advances that gradually reduced the defenders' capacity for resistance. The educational reforms of the Macedonian period reflected the empire's commitment to systematic learning and intellectual development. The reorganization of the imperial university involved the careful selection of faculty, the development of comprehensive curricula, and the establishment of examination procedures that would ensure the maintenance of academic standards. Students progressed through their studies according to carefully structured timetables, each stage of learning building upon the previous, with the patience that characterized all Byzantine educational endeavors. The missionary activities of Saint Cyril and Methodius among the Slavs exemplified the empire's approach to cultural and religious expansion. The development of the Glagolitic script required years of careful linguistic analysis, during which the brothers examined the phonetic structure of Slavonic languages and devised a writing system that would accurately represent their sounds. The translation of liturgical texts into Slavonic proceeded with systematic thoroughness, ensuring that every nuance of meaning was preserved in the new language. The naval campaigns of the 10th century against the Arabs demonstrated the empire's capacity for maritime warfare, conducted according to the same principles of careful planning and methodical execution that governed all military endeavors. The construction of the imperial fleet required extensive coordination between shipbuilders, naval architects, and maritime suppliers. Each vessel was built according to specifications that had been refined through generations of naval experience, with every detail of construction carefully supervised by master craftsmen. The reconquest of Crete under Nicephorus Phocas in 961 AD represented the culmination of decades of patient planning and preparation. The expedition involved the coordination of naval and land forces on a scale that required months of advanced preparation. Every aspect of the campaign, from the assembly of troops to the organization of supply lines, was planned with the systematic thoroughness that characterized Byzantine military operations. The actual conquest of the island proceeded with methodical persistence, each fortified position being reduced through patient siege work rather than hasty assault. The reign of Basil II, beginning in 976 AD, marked the apogee of Byzantine military power and administrative efficiency. The emperor's Bulgarian campaigns, which would continue for decades, exemplified the empire's capacity for sustained military effort, conducted according to principles of patient persistence and methodical planning. Each campaign season was preceded by careful preparations involving the assembly of supplies, the recruitment of troops, and the detailed planning of operations designed to gradually reduce Bulgarian resistance through systematic pressure rather than dramatic confrontation. The death of Basil Sit in 1025 AD marked the beginning of a period that would unfold with the same measured pace that had characterized the empire's earlier development, yet now this methodical progression would lead toward gradual decline rather than expansion. The transition from the Macedonian dynasty to the rule of Constantine VIII and his successors proceeded according to established protocols of imperial succession, each ceremony conducted with the elaborate attention to detail that had become characteristic of Byzantine court life. The reign of Constantine Monomachos, beginning in 1042 AD, exemplified the empire's approach to governance during this period of slowly accumulating challenges. The emperor's court was renowned for its scholarly atmosphere, where intellectuals gathered to engage in lengthy discussions of philosophy, theology, and literature. These gatherings took place in chambers adorned with silk hangings and illuminated manuscripts, where the soft murmur of learned conversation created an atmosphere of contemplative tranquility that seemed to exist in a world apart from the pressing concerns of military and administrative necessity. The emergence of the Seljuk Turks as a major threat to the empire's eastern provinces unfolded gradually through a series of raids and incursions that initially seemed no more significant than the countless frontier skirmishes that had characterized Byzantine-Arab relations for centuries. The imperial response followed established patterns of frontier defense, involving the systematic reinforcement of border fortifications and the careful coordination of defensive measures with local commanders. Each report from the eastern provinces was received, filed, and considered according to bureaucratic procedures that had been refined through generations of administrative practice. The Battle of Manzikert in 1071 AD, while a significant military defeat, was preceded by months of careful preparation that followed the traditional patterns of Byzantine military planning. Emperor Romanos IV, Diogenes, assembled his army through the same systematic process of recruitment and supply that had served the empire for centuries. The campaign itself was planned with attention to all the logistical details that had made previous expeditions successful. The calculation of provisions, the establishment of supply depots, and the coordination of movements with allied forces. The aftermath of Manzikert demonstrated the empire's institutional resilience as the administrative machinery continued to function despite the military setback. The process of reorganizing the eastern defenses proceeded according to established protocols, involving extensive consultation between military commanders, provincial administrators, and court officials. Each adjustment to defensive arrangements was carefully documented and implemented through the same bureaucratic channels that had governed such matters for generations. The civil wars that followed the capture of Romanos IV unfolded with the complex maneuvering and careful alliance building that had characterized Byzantine political conflicts for centuries. Each faction conducted its operations according to established patterns of recruitment, funding, and diplomatic negotiation. The administration of territories under competing claims required the same attention to detail that governed normal imperial administration, with each side maintaining elaborate bureaucratic structures even in the midst of military campaigns. The First Crusade, beginning in 1096 AD, presented the empire with unprecedented challenges that were addressed through the same methodical approach that had been applied to previous diplomatic and military problems. Emperor Alexios IV Komnenos received the crusading armies according to established protocols for dealing with foreign military forces, conducting negotiations that followed traditional patterns of diplomatic exchange. The provision of supplies and guides for the crusading armies required the same systematic coordination that had supported imperial military expeditions for centuries. The reign of John II Komnenos, beginning in 1118 AD, marked a period of methodical military campaigning designed to restore imperial control over territories lost during the previous century. Each expedition was planned with the same attention to detail that had characterized successful Byzantine campaigns in the past. The emperor's Anatolian campaigns proceeded season after season, with each year bringing careful preparations for limited objectives pursued through patient siege work and systematic reduction of enemy strongholds. The scholarly activities of the Komnenian period reflected the empire's continued commitment to intellectual pursuits, conducted according to traditional patterns of Byzantine learning. The historical works of Anna Komnenos and other court intellectuals were composed with the same methodical attention to detail that characterized all aspects of imperial administration. These writers spent years gathering information, consulting archives, and preparing their narratives with the systematic thoroughness that had made Byzantine scholarship renowned throughout the medieval world. The Second Crusade, beginning in 1147 AD, was managed by Manuel I Komnenos through the same diplomatic and logistical channels that had been used to handle the First Crusade. The emperor's negotiations with crusading leaders followed established patterns of Byzantine diplomacy, involving lengthy discussions of routes, supplies, and mutual obligations. The provision of guides and provisions for the crusading armies required the mobilization of the same administrative machinery that supported all major imperial undertakings. The Italian campaigns of Manuel Fern represented the empire's continued commitment to Western expansion, pursued through traditional methods of systematic military planning and diplomatic maneuvering. Each expedition to southern Italy was preceded by months of preparation involving the assembly of naval forces, the coordination of supply lines, and the cultivation of local alliances. The sieges of Norman strongholds proceeded with the patient persistence that had characterized Byzantine military operations for centuries. The theological controversies of the 12th century, particularly those surrounding the writings of Soterichos Pantougenos, were addressed through the same systematic approach that had been applied to previous doctrinal disputes. Church councils examined the disputed teachings with methodical thoroughness, consulting patristic authorities and engaging in lengthy debates that followed established patterns of theological discourse. The resolution of these controversies required the same patient deliberation that had characterized ecclesiastical decision-making throughout the empire's history. The administrative reforms of the Komnenian period involved the same systematic revision of governmental procedures that had characterized previous periods of institutional change. The reorganization of the theme system required extensive consultation with provincial administrators, detailed assessment of local conditions, and careful implementation of new arrangements over a period of years. Each adjustment to administrative procedures was documented and implemented through established bureaucratic channels. The Third Crusade, beginning in 1189 AD, was managed by Isaac II Angelus through diplomatic and administrative channels that had been refined through nearly a century of experience with crusading armies. The passage of Frederick Barbarossa's forces through imperial territory required the same careful coordination of supplies and security measures that had been developed for previous crusades. The emperor's negotiations with crusading leaders followed established patterns of diplomatic exchange, involving lengthy discussions of routes, obligations, and mutual guarantees. The Fourth Crusade, beginning in 1202 AD, initially seemed to follow the same patterns as its predecessors, with Alexios IV Angelos conducting negotiations with crusading leaders according to established diplomatic protocols. The empire's response to the Crusaders' diversion to Constantinople followed traditional patterns of defensive preparation, involving the systematic reinforcement of the city's walls and the careful coordination of naval and land defenses. The siege of Constantinople itself proceeded with the same methodical approach that had characterized all major military operations, though this time the empire's traditional methods would prove insufficient to prevent the catastrophe that would end this period of Byzantine history. The administrative continuity that had characterized the empire throughout this period of gradual decline demonstrated the remarkable resilience of Byzantine institutional structures. Even as military pressures mounted and territorial losses accumulated, the machinery of government continued to function according to patterns that had been established centuries earlier. Clerks continued to copy documents, judges continued to hear cases, and administrators continued to collect taxes according to procedures that had changed little since the time of Justinian. The scholarly and artistic achievements of this period reflected the empire's continued commitment to intellectual and cultural pursuits despite mounting external pressures. The mosaics of the Komnenos period were created according to artistic traditions that had been refined through centuries of Byzantine craftsmanship, while the theological and historical writings of the era demonstrated the persistence of intellectual traditions that had made Constantinople a center of learning throughout the medieval world. The Empire of Nicaea, established by Theodore I Lascaris in 1204 AD, represented the most successful attempt to maintain Byzantine traditions during the period of Latin occupation. The court at Nicaea developed its own elaborate ceremonial protocols, carefully adapted from the traditions of the Great Palace in Constantinople. Each aspect of imperial ceremony was preserved and refined through the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized court life for centuries. The daily routines of the Nicaean court followed patterns that had been established in Constantinople, with the same careful attention to precedence, protocol, and symbolic significance. The scholarly activities of the Nicaean period reflected the empire's continued commitment to intellectual pursuits despite the changed circumstances. The copying of manuscripts proceeded in scriptoriums established according to traditional patterns, where scribes worked with the same patient devotion that had characterized their predecessors in Constantinople. The preservation of classical and patristic texts required the same systematic approach that had made Byzantine scholarship renowned throughout the medieval world, with each manuscript copied according to established standards of accuracy and artistic excellence. The military campaigns of John III Ducas Vatatzes, beginning in 1221 AD, demonstrated the empire's continued capacity for systematic military planning and execution. Each expedition against the Latin Empire was preceded by months of careful preparation involving the assembly of troops, the coordination of supply lines, and the cultivation of diplomatic alliances. The gradual reconquest of imperial territories proceeded with the patient persistence that had characterized Byzantine military operations for centuries, each fortress and city being systematically invested and reduced through traditional siege techniques. The theological controversies of the Nicaean period were addressed through the same systematic approaches that had been used to resolve doctrinal disputes throughout Byzantine history. The union of the churches, attempted by Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos, involved lengthy negotiations conducted according to established patterns of ecclesiastical diplomacy. The theological discussions required the same methodical examination of doctrinal differences that had characterized previous attempts at church unity, with scholars on both sides consulting vast libraries of patristic and conciliar authorities. The restoration of Byzantine rule in Constantinople in 1261 AD was accomplished through the same combination of military planning and diplomatic maneuvering that had characterized imperial policy for centuries. Michael VIII Palaiologos organized the recapture of the capital through systematic coordination of naval and land forces, while simultaneously conducting negotiations designed to prevent Western intervention. The ceremony of restoration followed traditional patterns of imperial triumph, carefully adapted to acknowledge both the significance of the achievement and the reduced circumstances of the restored empire. The reign of Andronikos II. Palaiologos, beginning in 1282 AD, exemplified the empire's approach to governance during this period of reduced resources and mounting challenges. The emperor's court maintained the elaborate ceremonial traditions that had characterized Byzantine imperial life, despite the increasingly constrained financial circumstances. Each aspect of court protocol was preserved with the same meticulous attention to detail that had been characteristic of the empire at the height of its power, though now these ceremonies took place in a much reduced physical and political context. The Catalan Company's devastation of imperial territories in the early 14th century was addressed through traditional patterns of diplomatic negotiation and military response. The empire's attempts to manage the crisis followed established protocols for dealing with foreign military forces, involving lengthy negotiations and systematic attempts to coordinate defensive measures. The administrative response to the company's depredations required the same careful documentation and systematic assessment of damages that had characterized imperial administration's response to previous military crises. The civil wars between the two branches of the Palaiologos family in the 14th century unfolded according to the complex patterns of alliance and betrayal that had characterized Byzantine political conflicts for centuries. Each faction maintained elaborate bureaucratic structures and conducted its operations according to established patterns of recruitment, funding, and diplomatic maneuvering. The administration of territories under competing claims required the same attention to ceremonial propriety and administrative detail that had governed imperial administration throughout its history. The theological disputes surrounding hesychasm in the 14th century were addressed through the same systematic approaches that had been used to resolve previous doctrinal controversies. The councils convened to examine the teachings of Gregory Palamas, and his opponents followed established patterns of theological discourse involving lengthy deliberations and careful examination of patristic authorities. The resolution of the controversy required the same patient scholarly investigation that had characterized Byzantine theological scholarship for centuries. The Ottoman conquests of the 14th and 15th centuries proceeded gradually, through a series of sieges and campaigns that unfolded with methodical persistence. The Ottoman approach to conquest demonstrated many of the same systematic qualities that had characterized Byzantine military operations, involving careful planning, patient siege work, and systematic consolidation of conquered territories. The empire's response to these challenges followed traditional patterns of diplomatic negotiation and defensive preparation, though the resources available for such responses were increasingly constrained. The Council of Ferrara Florence in 1438-1439 AD represented the empire's final major attempt to resolve the theological differences that separated the Eastern and Western churches. Emperor John V Palaiologos conducted the negotiations according to established patterns of ecclesiastical diplomacy, involving lengthy theological discussions and careful examination of doctrinal differences. The proceedings of the council followed traditional patterns of conciliar debate, with scholars from both sides engaging in systematic examination of the issues that had divided the churches for centuries. The reign of Constantine II's Palaiologos, beginning in 1449 AD, marked the final phase of Byzantine imperial history. The emperor's court maintained the ceremonial traditions that had characterized imperial life for over a millennium, despite the empire's reduction to little more than the city of Constantinople and its immediate surroundings. Each aspect of court protocol was preserved with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized the empire at the height of its power, though now these ceremonies took place in an increasingly surreal context of approaching doom. The final siege of Constantinople in 1453 AD unfolded with the same methodical approach that had characterized Ottoman military operations throughout their period of expansion. Sultan Mehmed II's preparations for the siege involved months of systematic planning, including the construction of elaborate siege works and the coordination of naval and land forces. The defenders of the city responded according to traditional patterns of Byzantine defensive strategy, though they were vastly outnumbered and outgunned by the Ottoman forces. The daily routine of the siege proceeded with mechanical regularity, each day bringing the same pattern of bombardment, assault, and defensive response. The defenders maintained their positions according to traditional patterns of military organization, with each section of the walls assigned to specific groups of soldiers who carried out their duties with the same systematic approach that had characterized Byzantine military service for centuries. The gradual weakening of the defenses proceeded with inexorable logic, as the accumulated effects of bombardment and assault slowly reduced the city's capacity for resistance. The final assault on May 29, 1453 AD brought to an end more than 1,000 years of Byzantine imperial history. Yet even in its final moments, the empire maintained the dignity and systematic approach that had characterized its entire existence. The defenders fought according to established patterns of military honor, while the administrative apparatus of the city continued to function until the very end. The last emperor, Constantine V, died fighting on the walls of his capital, maintaining to the final moment the traditions of imperial leadership that had guided the empire through centuries of glory and decline. The fall of Constantinople marked the end of an empire that had demonstrated throughout its long history a remarkable capacity for systematic governance, methodical adaptation to changing circumstances, and patient persistence in the face of overwhelming challenges. The Byzantine Empire's greatest achievement was perhaps not any single military victory or architectural monument, but rather its ability to maintain for over a millennium the same basic approaches to governance, scholarship, and cultural life that had made it a beacon of civilization throughout the medieval world. Even in its final decline, the empire maintained the same careful attention to ceremony, the same systematic approach to administration, and the same patient commitment to the preservation of knowledge that had characterized it from its very beginning.